But yeah, maybe we can get started, and then people will be joining. I just wanted to say that, well, yes, in a way it was inevitable. We were expecting this, and at a surface level, we could say that well, it's very appropriate for a seminar on mimesis to be using a medium like this that represents phantoms far removed from embodied realities. But unfortunately, the notion of mimesis that we are interested in is not the usual representational one, as you know by now, but it is an embodied, affective, immanent one. And everything that we are missing in any sense today, kind of the proximity, the room, the sounds, the drinks after the seminar, all these are components of Homo mimeticus as we understand it. That is an embodied, an immanent conception of mimesis. So what is missing is Homo mimeticus in a certain sense, but that's not completely true, because as I was saying before, there is a supplement to mimetic media that allows us to be together while being very, very distant. And so we see new faces or old faces that we've seen before, but cannot be here usually in the flesh and can join us virtually. So mimesis has indeed the structure of a supplement, of a pharmacon, both a sort of poison, but also a kind of remedy. And that is indeed central to the reading of today, Plato's Pharmacy. I should say that it's also central to Bernard Stiegler's recuperation of the Derridian notion of the pharmacon with respect to technology. And very sadly, he passed away, as many of you know, I think, this summer. The Homo Mimeticus project had a meeting with Stiegler scheduled for, I think it was beginning of September or end of August, for a HOM interview, and he had kindly agreed to do it. And he was actually pressing for anticipating the interview in March. Originally, it was scheduled for March, just after, when the lockdown occurred. And I regret now that I didn't simply go to Paris, because March and now wouldn't have made any difference. I also take the occasion to say that Roland pointed out that there is a conference on Stiegler organized by the University of Leiden, and it's in December. So maybe, Roland, you can circulate that poster that you sent. I think it resonates well with what we're doing here. And Jean-Luc Nancy will be giving one of the lectures, the keynote lectures.
Maybe you can, since you have the link, you can put it on your website.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yes, I'll use the technology that we have, and I'll put it on the website. And then, yes, if you agree, we can try to keep it a little bit shorter than usual, since I assume many of you have had quite a bit of Zoom time already for the week. So we have to try to manage it in small doses if you want to get through what promises to be a long winter. So maybe keep it between 1 hour and 15 minutes, 1 hour and 30 maximum, so that we have some energies left. And I'll keep my introductory remarks very brief then, before giving the word to Jacob. Yes, Laura?
Just one moment. Can you let Philip in? Because it looks like he's waiting to be admitted.
Yeah. Thanks for telling me. Yes, I'm admitting them, and should be joining a lot of people that I hadn't seen. Good. So they're connecting. I'll wait just a second.
Hi.
Hi, Teresa.
Hi, very nice to see you.
Yes, I was just saying that the advantage of technology is that we can meet despite the physical distance. How are things in Portugal?
I don't know how to answer that, but
Shouldn't ask that question. Yes.
I think I'm okay. Well, I don't know. Well, I'm happy that you are all okay and that we can still work together.
Yes, and good to see so many of you joining. There are a number of people just still connecting. I don't see the faces now, but yeah, I was just introducing this session, pointing out that technology operates as a pharmacon in the Derridian and Stiglerian sense, which is very much in line with Homo mimeticus. And I was in the midst of making some announcements. One of them is that it's a good news. We are with Carol, whom I don't see yet, Carol Guess, who is the new Homo mimeticus team member. We are organizing a conference on the posthuman. It's gonna take place on the 20th to the 22nd of May. The title is Posthuman Mimesis, and Catherine Hales agreed to be the keynote speaker. So we're excited to have Hales. We don't know yet whether it's going to be a physical conference or a remote conference, but we probably will have both options and adapt to the situation. And we'll circulate the call for paper soon. So if you have friends and colleagues who are interested in the posthuman, don't hesitate to forward it. And then we were planning during the last session to show a screening of Jean-Luc Nancy's video interview, and we sensed that things were not going to get better, and so we anticipated and had a premiere online directly. And the video is now on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it anytime you want. By the way, you should check out, if you haven't seen yet, you probably see yourselves at some point. And I didn't go through lengthy formulaires to ask for approvals of your presence in the video, but you'll be in it and you're in good company. It's with Jean-Luc Nancy, so I hope you don't mind. And so last time we talked about Hillis Miller, Jean-Luc Nancy, and now Derrida, and there is an obvious continuity in these figures, and we should feel free to come back to either questions that you have with respect to Nancy's interview or Hillis Miller's interview as well. And I just wanted to say very briefly 2 points. That basically the general wager of the Homo mimeticus, I've been saying it repeatedly, but I think it's important to say, is that it attempts to account for the manifestations of mimesis today, which include the rise of neo-fascist leaders, which include fake news, which include conspiracy theories, and pandemics, because pandemics generate contagious effects. And one of the tasks that seems to us important in the 21st century, we are in the midst of a 6th extinction, is to be able to look ahead, to be able to try to anticipate on what is to come. And in order to do so, we have adopted a genealogical approach that we don't claim to come up with radically new theories of mimesis, but we look back. We look back to figures that provide us with conceptual insights and tools that help us think the present. And last time we talked about Girard and how Girard in a way is a useful thinker because he provides an anthropological theory of mimesis that has to do with scapegoating mechanisms that are still very much with us and are relevant. And yet he restricts the notion of mimesis to desire. And we said that, well, that's kind of, determined by the climate, intellectual climate of the 60s. And so our task is to open it up to the more, the broader notion of pathos, which includes all kinds of affects, be they good or bad. So that's what's one figure, an important precursor, I think, is Girard. The other one is Derrida, and more generally, figures who write in the wake of deconstruction. Philippe Lacoulabart, obviously, Stigler, and Malabou, many others. And I noted the concept of pathology, spelled with a dash and a bracket, understood as both a sickness and a critical logos on mimetic pathos as constitutive of Homo mimeticus. And so I'm happy to acknowledge that one of the source of inspiration of that concept is obviously Derrida's notion of the pharmacon as both poison and cure. So he is a major figure behind the Homo mimeticus project, and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe in many ways brings this notion of this pharmacology to bear on the notion of subjectivity. So we are as much in line with Girard as we are with Derrida. Our project is in a way in between, tries to fray a middle ground and open up intellectual space to account for mimetic phenomena that both Girard and Derrida did not have to confront or did not explicitly confront, like the rise of new fascism or now pandemics. So there is an embodied dimension that goes beyond writing, beyond the logic of écriture, that is physical, that is immanent, that is political. But these two figures remain very important to us. And interestingly, Girard and Derrida are considered as opposites, but because Girard is interested in sameness and Derrida in difference. But as Jacob, I think, will allow us to see from the quotes that he selected, there are a number of continuities between Derrida and Girard. So many. I mean, the pharmacos, the scapegoat, is a concept that Derrida ties to the pharmacon. And not only that, so if you read closely, as we're planning to do Plato's Pharmacy, you will see that that text is a seminal text for mimetic theory, for Girard, for Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe on the notion of the impropriety of the subject, of the type, and of course for the Homo mimeticus. So with this very brief introduction, I'll give the word to Jacob to lead us into this text that many of us, I think, have read already before, but I think it's always stimulating to reread it because it's incredibly rich and it's a brilliant reading of the Phaedrus as well. So Jacob, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Nidesh. Thank you for that introduction and for having me come and lead discussion. Yes, Plato's Pharmacy is a very rich text. It was quite difficult choosing which quotes to include in the outline, but of course, there's the reading, selected portions of the reading itself. You can feel free to reference. I don't plan to walk through the outline systematically necessarily, but just to provide some of the main points and then specific quotes that we can delve into more deeply later if we like. Mainly, what I would like to do briefly is to discuss some prominent themes that Derrida introduces in Plato's Pharmacy and explore how we may use them to interpret some of his later writings as well, specifically in The Beast and the Sovereign, and some of his discussion of humanity and animality and how that operates at on the political scale. He doesn't make this connection explicit, and he doesn't talk as much about mimesis in The Beast and the Sovereign, for instance, but I have a hunch that it's there in the background, and so I will propose that and look forward to seeing what others think if they agree and see some mimetic notions at play there. So in Plato's Pharmacy, Derrida discusses the figure of Thoth, the Egyptian god, whom Socrates discusses in the Phaedrus. And in discussing Thoth, Derrida brings up important, very fundamental tenets of his philosophy, and that he will continue to develop throughout his philosophical career. One is that nothing is self-identical. There is no pure identity. And so with Thoth, you have this ambivalence at play, in that Thoth is a god of calculation and arithmetic, but also a god of chance. Thoth is a god of medicine, but also a god of death. And in at least some mythological traditions, Thoth created himself. So then you have the compromise between pure father, pure son. You have Thoth being both father and son. And any time you have Thoth being opposed to something or another god, you have this notion of what Girard calls mimetic doubling, or at least has similar resonances with Girard's notion of mimetic doubling, where when you have these two figures or themes in opposition, they begin to resemble one another. And so once again, there is no pure identity, because identity already includes difference. Sameness and difference are co-constitutive, and one subject already includes its opposite. And this, of course, becomes clear with Derrida's discussion of the pharmakon, where you have both medicine and poison at play, this ambivalence there within the very idea of pharmakon, and which is exemplified, Derrida believes, with the figure of Thoth. So just as there is no pure identity, there's also no pure origin. And this is, again, clarified in Derrida's discussion of the figure of Thoth. And then since Thoth is also the god of writing, Derrida can explore the notion of language in writing, which is one of his favorite ways to approach philosophy. And in writing, you have no pure origin, according to Derrida, because words can only have meaning or multiple meanings when they are within a system of language. But likewise, there can be no system of language without words. And so you cannot have this pure word that has a concrete, specified, absolute meaning, and then other words next to it. Rather, words are always in this constant interplay with one another. And so even notion like cure, the idea of cure already within the notion incorporates disease, its opposite. And so there is no pure identity, there is no pure origin. And Derrida, in this text of Plato's Pharmacy, is challenging the very simplistic idea of signifier and signified. We have the table, the concrete object, and then we have the word table. So the word table is the signifier, table is signified, very clear cut, all wonderful, all good. Derrida, of course, challenges this. It's constant play of signifiers that are in a dynamic relation with one another. So language itself has this dynamic flux. But likewise, language is not contained to what we often refer to as language. For Derrida, this applies to basically everything. It applies to relations, it applies to political actions, it can apply to violence, as Girard will specifically elaborate on. So Derrida is discussing ultimately this mimetic interplay that generates identities, not pure identities, but nonetheless, it generates these differences that constitute one another. So mimesis for Derrida, as with most mimetic scholars, if not all mimetic theorists, is not that of you have a pure object or subject here and a pure object or subject here, and then they start imitating one another. Rather, you have already the mimesis at play, and then they begin to, their identities begin to solidify to a certain degree because of this mimetic interplay, this dynamic back and forth. And so Derrida discusses the pharmakon and then relates it to the notion of the scapegoat, which, as Nidesh has already brought up, highlights yet another similarity with Derrida and Girard. The scapegoat is that, let's say, for instance, an animal that is sacrificed for the well-being of the community, of the state, for example. But with the notion of a scapegoat, you have something that is evil or chaotic. There's the identification of we are having problems within our community, and it is because of this thing, this problem, this scapegoat. So we need to sacrifice. But then once the scapegoat is sacrificed, there is peace in the region. So you have this interesting interplay where the very source, so to speak, of the problem becomes also the source of the solution. And this also, this notion of the scapegoat, challenges the idea of inside and outside for Derrida, because you have scapegoats that are raised within the community, but then they are also perceived as being outside of the community. They are other than us, but nonetheless, they come from within and then are brought outside. So Mimesis already at this very early stage has this interesting political connotation. And later on, I believe, Derrida will apply this to modern day nation states, and how modern day nation states in the political spheres also are haunted by a certain mimetic interplay, where there's this notion of scapegoating. And likewise, with scapegoating, you have animality. Now, animality and humanity are closely intertwined, and they play off one another in a political way. So he quotes Machiavelli, who advises the prince to act like an animal in order to properly run and govern humans. So there's an interesting dynamic where you have animals as other than humans, but nonetheless, in order to be human, we have to incorporate certain animalistic behaviors, or behaviors we at least associate with certain animals. But then at the same time, when especially modern day nation states want to justify themselves and justify violence and at times oppression, they will often use the philosophical notions of humanity, but also animality. And this is an insight that Derrida highlights when he is reading Carl Schmitt, and specifically Carl Schmitt's criticism of the notion of human rights, or acting for humanitarian reasons. Because throughout history, what Carl Schmitt argues is that you have this idea of, oh, we are going to defend humanity, we are going to be humanitarian. But then this requires us being the noble nation state, to treat other humans as outside humanity. So you end up treating other humans as beasts. They are not human, they are outside of the sphere of human morality. So ironically, a nation state like the US, for example, as Derrida brings up working off of some of Noam Chomsky's analysis, the US will treat its enemies as animals, but yet do so in the name of humanity. In order to be human, we have to treat these people, this regime, as an animal, as a beast. But then this is even further complicated, because you even have official US strategy saying, well, in order to intimidate our enemies, we need to act as an animal as well. We need to act out of control. There has to be this threat of just unhinged, stupid violence. Derrida is working a lot with and playing around with the French word bête, but also stupid, has all those different connotations. So we have to be human, and in order to be human and safeguard humanity and act for human rights, we have to dehumanize other humans, and then we have to dehumanize ourselves and act like animals, act like beasts, in order to treat them like beasts. We see here this interesting interplay: humanity, animality, identity, otherness, the scapegoating of certain groups of people, political opponents. And so that is, I think, while Derrida does not make this mimetic connection explicit, I believe there is this mimetic background to his political analysis. And then, as Nidesh discussed, it's also in this seminar we want to look forward, or at least look to the modern day examples. I included in the handout an interesting statement from the White House press office, which was made under in the Trump administration, talking about MS-13, this international gang that Trump has used them in order to justify his very harsh border policies. And in this White House press release, the entire thing explicitly refers to MS-13 members as animals. They are violent animals. They do all these horrible things. I didn't include the entire press release, but there's even a description of all these terrible things they've done. And the implication being these are beasts. They have no morality. They're not really humans. And so we need to just do whatever we can to bring them to justice. But likewise, whereas there's this us-them mentality, there's also the notion that MS-13 has infiltrated the US, and they are infiltrating the US. So they're not just this gang that is outside of the United States. They are also a part of us, and we need to try and in a way, take care of them, bring them to justice, get them out. But all of this is bringing in this interesting dynamic, animality, humanity, inside, outside, the scapegoating mechanism. And of course, while the measures that Trump's administration takes are not made explicit, you can hear the echoes of this US strategy of we're not going to be held back by any moral standards because we're dealing with animals. Why should we hold ourselves to any other standard? So you have this justification of violence and what we would think of as inhumane policies and actions based on this mimetic dialogue, this mimetic language of humanity and animality, and specifically how that is being used to constitute the identity of a country and also the purpose and guiding mission of, you could say, a neo-fascist regime. So that is a brief overview of some of the themes and texts that I included in the outline and in the sample readings, and some of the themes I wanted to bring up. But now I'd like to open it up for any comments or questions on any of the readings or points made.
Thanks very much, Jacob, for this concise and elegant introduction that strings together a number of problematics in very dense texts, establishing the connection between Derrida, Girard, and contemporary politics. So these are connections that you built. They're not explicit, right? They're not there in the text. Girard doesn't say, oh, I take inspiration from Plato's pharmacy in order to develop a theory of the scapegoat. It requires that kind of genealogical reading, and I think that your presentation brought it up very well, and that it's relevant to the contemporary situation. So yes, anyone should feel free to jump in. Maybe you raise your hand, or you just enter the discussion. Questions for Jacob? Questions about the text? About the specific interpretation of mimesis that Derrida mobilizes? Maybe I start with a question of curiosity myself. You explicitly selected passages in Plato's Pharmacy that seem quasi-Girardian, right? Out of context, it would be, well, you'd notice, I mean, if you're a Derrida specialist because of the language, but it would be actually very difficult to determine the author. What led you to select the Girardian moments in Derrida that are usually downplayed both by the Derridians and by the Girardians? There are a few exceptions, but there are not many that I know of.
Yes, no, it's a good question. I Well, I would say that I was first introduced to mimetic theory through reading Girard, and it wasn't until later I'd read Derrida, but was not as familiar with Plato's Pharmacy, and it wasn't until later that I began to read and see similar themes in Derrida's text. And interestingly, that well, this text is written in or published at least in 1968, and then Violence and the Sacred is published 4 years later. And so you do wonder about implicit or explicit influences that are not explicitly discussed in some of these texts, how these scholars are influencing one another. I think part of my motivation for highlighting these specific portions of the text was that they are, I guess, relevant for the idea that there is a mimesis, there's a mimetic interplay at work with Derrida's analysis of nation states and the beast and the sovereign. And I think, especially since Girard very much focuses on violence and mimetic violence, picking out those passages within Derrida's text that also highlight those connections, perhaps made for a more explicit connection, in my opinion, to see that some of these themes that were maybe more implicit in Plato's Pharmacy seem to be influencing some of his later political analysis as late as 25, 30 years later.
Something I was wondering about, Nidesh, if I may. Thank you, Jacob, for this. I'm very glad you brought in the sovereign and the beast and animality as a topos, which is clearly also there in Plato's Pharmacy, but in ways that are not properly developed, really. And also in the sovereign and the beast, the animality that Derrida was sort of thinking of and about towards the end of his writing career, strikes me now in retrospect as being extremely homogenizing. That there is a form of speciesism at work there, to which I think most of us were blind at that time, but which now when I reread it and I think about it, I sort of think there is no such thing as an animal. There is a huge amount of different animals. Most of them have been killed by us by now, but they all have very different sort of ways of being in the world, and those differences of being in the world very often have to do with mimetic impulses and mimetic behaviors. The most obvious being the difference between wolves and dogs, domestic dogs. So I was wondering whether you'd given that any thought when you were sort of thinking about this.
Yes, it's a very good point, because in The Animal That Therefore I Am, he makes that explicit criticism of the what he calls the Cartesian tradition. So he singles out people like philosophers like Descartes and Levinas and others, and he says, there is no such thing as the animal, because that is too homogenizing. And he says there's also no such thing as the human, and he challenges this notion of having the human on one side and the animal on the other.
That's right.
But at the same time, he doesn't want to blend them all. He'll separate himself from someone like maybe Peter Singer, who will want to say, well, humans are just animals. Say, well, there are differences, but you have to be attentive to the differences between a human and a lizard, and a human and a shark, and a human and a gorilla, and a human and a bee. That's to say that that's all just one difference doesn't make sense. So it's interesting he brings that up there. So because of that, when I read The Beast and the Sovereign, and you may have a different take, I read it as him exploring the certain ideas of animality and humanity and how they have functioned and influenced the formation of political ideas and political bodies. And not necessarily saying this is true, but this is how animals have been interpreted, and this is how humanity has been interpreted, and then trying to bring out this genealogy without necessarily subscribing himself to that interpretation. So that's how I read his seminar there. Though, yeah, of course.
And no, and I think you're perfectly right there. And I'm not so much. I'm not suggesting that Derrida is sort of lumping all animals together, but by keeping the animal as the other of the human, even while denying that, there is no actual engagement with, I repeat my previous point, with the specificity of individual animal umwelte and the way that they are positioned in their various different niches and their various different ways of relating to those niches and to us. And so I'm just thinking, I was just struck when rereading this again, that in our current state of eco-nervousness, we are reading things differently than at the time when these things were written.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I see, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a very good point to bring up.
Daniel wants to say something.
Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Yes, thanks for this great presentation. I'm really happy to be able to see this. We had this idea that you could share your work with us a long time ago, so I'm very happy to see it.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah. I also went fishing into Beast and the Sovereign for figures of Mimesis a long time ago. And so I wanted to share the little bit that I fished out, because I think it's appropriate for this, specifically this discussion. The one thing that I really, and I haven't studied the animal that I am very closely, but the one notion that I take from it that is interesting is the idea of the animal. Is this play in which animal in French is animal, A-U-X, or animals, A-A-U-X, but he writes it animal, M-O-T. So it's an animal word. It's an animal word. So it's a figure for animality. So it never. So this is to Ortwin's point. Philosophers don't talk about animals. They talk about word animals. They talk about they mobilize figures of animals, and those figures have a very specific function in all of that philosophy. For Heidegger, they mean they are pouring world. For Descartes, they mean it's a machine, so it's always a word, not really an animal. So the animal really always kind of remains outside of being properly thought. That's one of the problems, but these figures come to be mobilized a lot. So I'm really interested in particular in that there is one animal, there is one figure that mobilizes animals or animality in a specific way, which is very mimetic. That is very clear, I think, in the Beast of the Sovereign. It's a passage that we didn't have, but I think you alluded to it. But I think there's an extra point about that animal that can be brought out, because Machiavelli doesn't just say that the prince should behave like a beast.
Right.
There's a whole network in there, not just a network, but there's a duplicity at first. He says he should be sometimes like a fox and sometimes like a lion. So sometimes he should be cunning and sometimes he should be brutal. But then this is the interesting move. Derrida says, but when he says that he should be a fox because he's cunning, he's already saying that he should be that he should know how to be something else. The attribute, like the fox, the animal of the fox is a figure for cunning, for changing, for duplicity, for different aspects, for not being exactly what it is. So the prince, in being like the lion, the prince is being like the fox who's being like the lion. There's always, he points out at this kind of supplementarity to it. He says, The theory is really funny, so I'm going to read it. It's cunning, knowing and know-how as knowing how to trick, knowing how to lie, knowing how to perjure, knowing how to dissimulate, the knowing how not to make known of the fox. So all of this know-how, this fiction and dissimulation, right? So that's one important mimetic aspect that is at play there, is that there's, first of all, the animal is always a figure, and what characterizes the figure is that it's always something else. And the animal that more or less figures that figurality that he takes from Machiavelli is the prince, is the fox. I find that little bit really interesting. The fox is doubly mimetic. It's a paradigm for mimetic animality, and it's a paradigm for what the prince should be when the prince becomes an animal. So even when the prince is a beast, he's a cunning beast. He's not really just a dumb beast. He's a cunning dumb. So those duplicities are really interesting. But then the last thing to go back, and this I just realized when reading these two things side by side, is that if the fox is an animal for duplicity, for cunning duplicity, there's another animal, say, that is for like dumb imitation, which is the ape, the monkey. So it's the English expression, to ape something, and it works in German too. To imitate without thinking, without reasoning, just to follow, just to be dumb imitator is a monkey. The monkey is always the one that is figured as imitating stupidly, imitating with nothing more, imitating without knowing that it imitates or how it imitates. That's a bad mimesis. The one thing that I realized here is that Thought, the god of writing in Plato's Pharmacy, he's usually represented with the head of an ibis, right? He's an ibis, and Derrida makes it. There's a little passage. He's the ibis, eldest son of the original bird. He's born of an egg, but he's the egg to the simplicity. But Thought is also sometimes represented as a baboon. So Thought is always, it's also, first of all, it's double in that sense. He's an ibis, but he's also a monkey. And then once he's a monkey, he can start to figure all of these other double hybrid, imitative, double imitative. But he's a baboon. He's not just an ape. He's like a wise-looking monkey. The representations of it are always he's writing. So those two figures seem to me really interesting. Is the one that I would like to highlight as the animal as the thing that is the most imitative and the least imitative, or like the dumb imitation, the paradigm of dumb imitation or of cunning imitation. So every time, so it's not just every time it's mobilized. There's all of these dimensions on what it means to it, what kind of, in what ways you can imitate. You can imitate with a thought like a monkey, or you can imitate with cunning like a fox, and so on. For all of those moments, there's always these animals ready to be deployed to make that.
Thank you very much for that. I hadn't noticed the mimetic themes in those specific instances you mentioned, so I really appreciate bringing those out, and that's very good. Very good points that once again highlight how mimesis is playing a role in his analysis of animality, humanity, and specifically the political connotations of those. Thank you very much for that.
And just to add to that, Daniel, I mean, I think you're totally right, but it's also interesting that there should be a baboon as a monkey and not an ape in the stricter sense. And you know, the closer animals come to humans, the stupider their intelligence begins to look. And that is in itself quite interesting to observe, that the baboon is considered wise, whereas his or her imitative capacities in terms of access to the human realm of signification are far below those of primates. So there is some, I mean, that's basically what I was saying earlier on, that you know, we should definitely, given the interdisciplinary ambitions of Homo mimeticus, that's something that we should explore with more sensitivity. I think again, the specificity of these animal existences and the way they've been turned into animals which very often deny precisely that specificity by highlighting the extent to which they can be seen to comfortably represent human characters that we then use for our own purposes. I mean, lions can be just as foxy as foxes, but there are reasons, human reasons, why we don't want to compartmentalize, or why we want to compartmentalize the animal kingdom in these allegorical figures almost. And that's something that we should not just observe because we know this, but connect also to refined understanding of organic existence on the planet in terms of mimetic behavior.
That's a very good kind of line or trace that indeed we'll have to follow up, and it's interesting that we can get to animality and monkey see, monkey do behavior via Derrida, and that this question of mirror neurons emerged in macaque monkeys, and the question of whether monkeys imitate at all, it's a question that ethologists ask, and that it's currently under debate. Actually, that they're not very good imitators, monkeys. The monkey see, monkey do doesn't really work, but there are exceptions within specific type of monkeys that learn certain practices like washing potatoes and so forth. And going to ethology for that, I think, is an important suggestion. That's one of the models of pathologies. The logoi that we mobilize depend on the type of pathos that is at play, and that pathos is an animal pathos. Then ethology should be the discipline. So that's, I think, a very important point. But Laura, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just bringing us back a bit from ethology to the texts. What struck me in this, and what Ortun and Daniel were saying, is that we have this understanding of animals as having human characteristics, and that's basically a form of human mythology. And rereading the text now after a lot of years, rereading Plato's Pharmacy, what really struck me is how heavily it relies on mythology. And one interesting thing is that, so towards the beginning of Plato's Pharmacy, Derrida basically asserts that Socrates' goal was to send the myths on vacation, to dismiss the myths. And then he builds this metaphor or this analogy of language and what writing and what writing accomplishes, based fully on the myth of thought. So thought is at the same time a symbol for medicine and for death, at the same time a symbol for writing, and at the same time a symbol for rebirth, and at the same time all these things. So therefore, and at the same time a very good instance of the supplement. Therefore, writing is a supplement. Therefore, writing performs all these things that the myth initially performed. And I find this very interesting because it just in a way suggests that Derrida's whole philosophical articulation could, I don't think it does, but could be said to rely on this myth. Like he links this myth so strongly with his argument that it almost sounds like he's doing metaphysics again, although one of his main purposes was to dismiss and to end with metaphysics, which he accused Heidegger of not doing enough of, right? So I just find it very interesting that to explore this link between myth and logos, and myth and rationality, also from the perspective of how we distinguish human from animal, right? Because of course there are different animals, as Ortun said, and everything, but when we try to find the specificity of the human, we usually go to rationality, but probably what we should also do is go to myths and how these inform our attitudes. And I think also the examples that Jacob gave from what's happening today with the U.S. demonization of rogue states, and also with the U.S.'s own policy, military policy, also has a lot to do with this mythical representation of the self and of the other. So I think one thing worth discussing here is how myth and logos kind of ramify into each other, and we go back with this to the redefinition of inside and outside, right? Myth is supposed to be irrational, so outside of logos, but actually logos kind of ramifies into myth, not as he says about Plato's text, not in a way that dissolves logos, but in a way that draws small connections and associations and parallels. So yeah, I think this is an interesting starting point for understanding how myth, which in my view is more mimetic or mimetically grounded than logos, how it actually informs logos and all the structures that we try to impose upon reality.
Yeah, thank you for that very insightful point. It's fascinating, that interplay between myth for Plato. So it is interesting, this this relation between the two, and that challenges any tidy definitions of either myth or logos. And thinking also, I'm also thinking of another myth, so to speak, of that in the New Testament, in Christian scripture, where the book of John says, in the beginning was the Word, and it has, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Derrida reinterprets or translates that, in the beginning was hermeneutics. And so there is always this, I think he likes to play around with these, what at least are presented or at least interpreted as straightforward myths or allegories, or explanations of the logos, but then highlight how the reality of their meaning is more complicated and intertwined with that which is outside of the myth or the logos. Yeah.
And to your point on the proximity between mimesis, writing, and myth, I think it's an interesting experiment when Plato is critiquing mimesis. If you put mythos in its stead, most of the time the critique is the same. So the critique of mimesis is a critique of myth, and myth is an ancient term for what we call today kind of literature, in many ways, and writing, and so it's interesting to me as well that Derrida's deep knowledge of the Greeks is in good part mediated by a figure that is not often mentioned, or maybe not anymore, a classicist, Jean-Pierre Vernon. I think Derrida was a careful reader of Vernon, and Vernon was present in Baltimore at that famous 1966 structural conference that was supposed to introduce structuralism, and he spoke about myth and translation, and both Girard and Derrida were there taking notes. And so I think that genealogy is interesting if one kind of locates, not in order to say, well, one what influenced the other, but to see how certain conceptual configurations emerge or crystallize at certain moments. They emerge from the bottom up. And Derrida doesn't say it very often in Plato's Pharmacy, but he uses the phrase genealogy of writing in order to account for what it's doing. And obviously Nietzsche is behind his head. Nietzsche is central to the talk that he gave on the structuralist controversy. And so for me, it is important for Homo mimeticus to account for this crystallization of concepts, be it the pharmacon, the scapegoat, the triangulation between father and sons via the case of Oedipus and so forth, because they remind us that theories don't drop from heaven. They don't come down ready-made as crystallized forms that are immutable. They're contingent. And back to Ortwin and Daniel's point about animality, now it's up to us to construe theories that account for the problems that are ours and that are different. And I think that is, the challenge. And it's certainly one of the challenges of Homo mimeticus, but not only. That is not only to do hermeneutic for the sake of hermeneutics. We are very good at that. We've been trained at that, close reading, but also in detaching certain conceptual configuration and kind of maybe dropping other aspects that are not relevant in order to account for problems that are different. One of the word that Derrida uses a lot, and it doesn't actually develop, is the idea of Socrates as a magician, as a pharmakeus, who hypnotize, meduse the audience. And that, for instance, I think it's a very interesting conception, the idea of Socrates as somebody who has the power to cast a spell that we can recuperate, not in relationship to, writing as he's theorizing it here, but in relationship to techniques as Stigler, for instance, and other post-Derridian thinkers are developing. Because I think that the new media do cast a spell that hypnotizes spectators in ways that still kind of rely on that interplay between the fox and the monkey, a conscious mimesis and unconscious mimesis, but via different dynamic in which we are dealing with algorithms, and that is different. So that requires a new kind of theorization. So just some thoughts that came to mind, kind of stringing together what you, Laura, and Ortwin and Daniel were saying before in relationship to Jacob. Other?
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for your short presentation, but very incisive. I was reading your pages earlier today, and I was recalling the role of animality in the human ancient relation to divinity. So, and Nidesh was just talking about Socrates as a magician, and the kind of destructive narcissistic effect of technology in a kind of enchanting way. And I was reading your selection of quotations about animals and animality, and it's fascinating because studying music, I came across some information about how humans used to kill but also emulate animals. We all know that by now, as a source of power. So that's very present in a very different and political way in your pages. And I was wondering if you have ever confronted this ancient dimension or kind of very, very old way of relating to an idea of animality or a concept of animality, that it's very, very present still today.
Yes, it's a good point. It is a connection I want to explore further. I think one example, which I think may be in the background of what you were discussing, is the oldest cave paintings, the oldest form of painting that so far has been discovered, is that of animals. and I believe, if I remember correctly, they're kind of human animal hybrids as well. And this goes back, yeah, tens of thousands of years. And so, yeah, from the beginning, the earliest art, if you want to use that term, that we have uncovered, is utilizing animals symbolically. And it's a very, yeah, quite important connection that I think could be explored further. And it also reminds me of there's an anthropologist, Paul Shepard, who provided a fascinating anthropological genealogy. I think it's How Animals Made Us Human. And he does a historical analysis based on what they've been able to research, and then goes also analyzes modern day examples of the importance of animals for human society and human culture, which there's a biological, even evolutionary level of we've co-evolved with non-human animals. Even when Homo sapiens evolved, there's always been this co-evolution at play. But then not only that, but culturally and symbolically, how humans, as far as every culture we have been able to encounter, or at least find records of, there is always an interesting dynamic with animals and animality and humanity interacting with one another, and humans understanding themselves in relation to animals, often in very different ways, but the connection seems to always be present. And so he contends that from the very beginning, this, even our self-identity, how humans have thought of themselves, has always been mediated through animals. So yes, all that to say, I think it's a very fascinating connection to explore, and I think you're right in that it should be explored further. I think there's a lot of great work to be done there, and that can shed light on even, yeah, contemporary examples and manifestations of it.
Teresa, could you say something more about what you said at the beginning about, as a musicologist, that you discovered this thing about sacrificing or killing animals? What precisely did you mean in terms of music?
Well, I have been translating a book of a French author, Pascal Quignard. I don't know if you know him. He's not quite scientific nor academic, but he has a very deep knowledge of some of his areas of research. And he has this book called La haine de la musique, in which he explores his personal relation with music. He was a musician. He was a director of a very famous program, which is Les Cancers des Nations, with Jordi Savall. And one day he just kind of interrupted his relation with music and with institutions that were with which he practiced his musical activities. And he wrote this book, and this book is like a very vast inquiry about several aspects of music, in which music has this narcotic effect on humans as a human phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And so he goes investigating and writing about the religious dimension, the mystical, the church institutions. And he also goes into the Holocaust, the role of music in the Holocaust and the 21st century fascist music issues or questions. And he has a small chapter. The book has 7 chapters. And one of they're called Petit Traité. And one of the chapters is about this ancient relation. And he kind of enumerates in a very personal literary way some of those examples that are known about imitating animals, impersonating animals as a source of access to something that brings together the divine and animal aspect of the humans as mimetic beings that have none of them. And well, I was recalling this while reading Jacob's pages, because most of the times aggression and imitation are present at the same time. They coexist.
Yeah. I know if you look at the origin of fucking as an English verb in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that it goes back to an ancient Dutch word which means striking and hitting, and then becomes breeding, and then becomes fucking. And also in contemporary Dutch, you still have fucken as breeding, not copulating in the vulgar English language way. But there is that coincidence between imitation and or mimesis and violence, definitely. That's there from the beginning. But the reason why I was asking, I was actually reminded of something I was listening to on the radio this morning, on the BBC News, opposition to the release of hundreds of thousands of pheasants and partridges in the English countryside for the hunt, because they screw up the ecosystem, obviously. They're bad in all kinds of ways. And the only reason why they're there is because a set of humans that can afford it wish to imitate the behavior of humans hunting to provide food for the tribe. And that imitation itself is entirely symbolic. It's a kind of technology that's totally spun out of control. It hasn't got anything to do with the original tool function, but it is a tool, a sort of perverted tool that now is creating destruction rather than bringing nourishment. And it's precisely that sort of that ritual dimension of that essentially mimetic practice in relation to animals that have to be killed for that practice to be successful. That got me thinking about your idea about the relation between humans deriving their identity and power from a destructive relation with animals. Sorry, I'm on my eco trip today.
No, thanks, Ortwin, and you're lending support to the Gerardian theory, so we're happy for that.
Without even knowing it.
But Annabelle, you had a point, yes.
Not a point, just a few remarks and questions. But thank you. That's a fascinating discussion. Now I just wanted, well, things that just came to mind when listening to you. It's indeed, I think, a question when I read Derrida. So La pharmacie de Platon, but also L'animal que donc je suis, and La bête et le souverain. So what should we do with the pharmacon, and what should we do with mimesis? How to engage that? And that's also a point that came up in the discussion. So this idea that it would be also important to engage animals as individuals and somehow real animals, but that's also quite tricky, and it's also something that several of you said, namely that it's impossible to disentangle a scientific approach and a more literary or mythical approach. And that's also Derrida's point, precisely. And what is interesting in Derrida's approach is that it does refer to real animals or even individuals, actually, or it tries to. But of course it's a bit disturbing when you read Animal que donc je suis, because he says, oh, that's an individual cat, that's the real cat. But obviously it's the cat with a lot of cultural and symbolical elements added to it. But still, I think it's interesting to take it seriously, the idea that that's the real cat. It's probably both. Actually, I think the main idea is precisely that it's both, and it's impossible to disentangle them, which is also I find interesting, because it's actually also the main challenge, I would say, of contemporary animal studies, because it's pluri cross-disciplinary by essence, and it's really about scientific working together with people in literary studies, eco-criticism, and so on. So that's a real challenge, how to understand and to know animals while, let's say, imagining them, engaging with them in a creative manner. Also because you have this idea that there is no such a thing as the real permanent essence of animals that should be simply recognized as such, because it's also something that has to be built through relations. I think that's also what was at stake somehow, that was foreshadowed by Derrida's reference to animals. Also his idea that the thought, so la pensée d'animal is poetry, so that's quite famous. So that's also part of it, I think. So namely, it has to be creative, and it is creative from the beginning, because animals are also creative, all of them actually. So that's why I think this idea that we should just go back to or take a look at what science has to say, or what ethology has to say, is indeed very relevant, but it should never be taken in a separate way. It shouldn't be separated from actually our more active engagement or mythical engagement of animals. But that's and that's also one thing that that also came to my mind while listening to you. Another way through which Derrida engages real animals is something that he refers to in The Beast and the Sovereign, namely Deleuze's becoming animals. So that's part of it, and that's also a mimetic process that is at work in L'animal que donc je suis. So actually, he actually becomes, or pretends, that's also a discussion, pretends that is becoming an animal. So you have all sorts of hints in the text, also like a dog trying to track, for instance, the monster that is this monster of the different philosophers who entirely denied the connection between humans and animals. So that's also a mimetic process. But mimetic also in the sense of engaging again, namely more responding than trying to know or trying to grip or trying to circumscribe an object. But again, this brings me to what was what is still my puzzlement when I read Derrida. So namely, I have used this word engage animals, but it's quite vague. And I'm really wondering how we can use also what Derrida says about the pharmacon. What should we do with the pharmacon? Namely, what is the right way of dealing with the pharmacon, since it's precisely ambivalent? And there is one last point that may be also a line of research here. There is this something that we haven't said today, but which is this play between beast and animal. So there is a little difference. Of course, there is actually more than a little difference, a big difference. But still, the animal, so the beast, that's really the caricature. Animal is also ambivalent, actually. So it's impossible to say, oh, we have just to give up the beast and go back to the animal, because the animal is also laden with all sorts of ideological connotations. But I have the feeling that what he says about the beast somehow is, and that's also brings us to something that Roland has worked a lot on, which is bêtise. Namely, maybe there is something about embracing stupidity, our stupidity. So this thing with the pharmacon, namely maybe accepting it or taking it in, that could be a let's say maybe a way, but I'm not sure about that actually. I'm quite puzzled by that. Again, what should we do with the pharmacon? So that's my, I don't know if I'm making sense here, but I wonder if taking the poison in might be a solution according to you, or not at all. So that's my question.
Thanks very much,
Yes.
Annabelle. I won't answer, but maybe I'll ask Roland, since it's a question of bêtise, a bit. What do you say, Roland?
Quite simple. We don't need to take la bêtise in, since we have it already. So we are already completely in that sense.
Yeah, well, what I mean by that is, I agree, of course, but what I mean by that is also embracing it. Because it's also quite difficult to say, oh, I'm stupid. And what do we mean by that? And can we live on an everyday basis by just saying, I'm stupid? What does it mean? I mean, socially speaking, it's problematic. It's actually not something that you can do easily. And I know, also in the academic world, so that's what I meant by that. And I have a feeling that Derrida is also I'm not sure what he's doing really with that. I have the feeling that sometimes it's also the idea, yes, Betis is always in, I agree. But still, we keep rejecting it, socially speaking. So that was my question.
I don't know. So it's complex. So maybe I'm more Deleuzian in the sense that, or Nietzschean, that we have to nuire à la bêtise. That's our task as philosophers, and not taking it in. And I mean, we are now submitted to many challenges that, in my eyes, prove that la bêtise is very sharp and very strong, present in our society. And so I don't see where you want to get in. So I think we all have a tendency. Of course, what do we mean by bêtise? For me, it's quite simple. It's based on the model of what Sartre calls la mauvaise foi. So it's the idea that we have principles, that we are someone, and that we have to defend the cause, etc. It's the idea that we can fall together with what we mean we are, etc. So the idea of lack of flexibility and all these things. So in that sense, la bêtise is also everything that is related to the adoption and the proliferation of cliches and of things, ready-made thought, etc. So things that do not need to be problematized anymore, and that are taken in as essential things. And I think, philosophy is our task is to not to criticize, but to first to confront us with that kind of form of stupidity.
Yeah. Well, so you see, we disagree actually, because that's what I meant by taking it in, exactly the opposite of what you are saying actually. Also because of Deleuze's point, namely, bêtise is, it's also the modeling of thoughts that can happen to us anytime. And that might be actually fruitful, chaotic sometimes, but might be fruitful. And also there is also this thing, if you say I have to laugh at bêtise, so then it can also be quite exclusive. So,
what do you mean I have to laugh at bêtise? I didn't say that.
Oh no, you say rire à la bêtise.
Nuire.
Nuire, ah ben d'accord.
No,
but it's okay. But it's even worse, it's even stronger. So yeah, so no, exactly. No, because I keep thinking also of this this idea that nuire à la bêtise has also this zoological dimension that is. Some people are regarded as more stupid than others, and classically.
No, that's not. I mean, of course, if you put it in a social dimension, that indeed we have a tendency to classify people between bêtise and other who are the elite of the intellectual, etc. But that's not the way in which I would focus the point. I would focus the point in a sense, more individual sense, namely that we all have a noyau de bêtise en nous. We are all stupid. In that sense, I don't see any advantage and any challenge to accept that stupidity in us. At the contrary, I would, and I don't see any thing creative out of stupidity. Not at all.
So, that's really the point of Pharmakon, actually, because that's the ambiguity of Pharmakon. That's is it in or is it out? And actually the point is precisely that you have just to overcome the duality, I guess. I would like to to have maybe others input on that, but that's why I connected to Pharmakon, because when I read about the Pharmakon, I have the feeling that there is a connection precisely about this thing about taking in or taking out, and that's probably beyond this distinction between taking in or taking out. But then that's where I have a hard time really thinking, let's say, a more nuanced version of it. Namely, I have tried to phrase it a bit roughly, but then when we have this discussion, we shouldn't take it in, or we should just harm it. But that for me, that's also not a completely. I don't see that as a full-fledged, let's say, definition of what we should do with the Pharmakon, really. I don't know if I'm making sense here, or I don't know if again I would I would like to hear how you would define what we should do with the pharmacon.
Yeah, maybe the comparison or the association of Betis with pharmacon, I wouldn't follow that. I don't see the evidence, so I don't see why.
Can I ask a question?
Laura has a question. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest maybe we should associate stupidity rather than with pharmacon. We should associate it with pharmacos, and I think we generally as a society we tend to treat so-called exponents of stupidity as pharmacos, as scapegoats, and say, okay, they're the stupid ones. We are going to make fun of them or isolate them or ostracize them so that we can feel smart, when what we should be doing is scapegoating our own stupidity, like eliminating our own stupidity. So I think it's a question of which level you do the scapegoating at, right? I think this kind of mediates between the perspective of Professor Brieur and Annabelle's perspective. Like, I think it's a question of where you draw the line, and the line should be, at least according to you, Professor Brieur, within us. Like, we should scapegoat our own tendencies rather than there's this phenomenon, Philip will know more about this, there's this phenomenon called cringing, and the whole, like, there's a big talk in social media about this, that you tend to, when you see some behavior that is typical of you, exacerbated and exaggerated in someone else, you cringe and you feel bad for yourself, but you start making fun of that person just to distinguish yourself from them. So it's one of the things we should be avoiding, I think.
Teresa, you want
Yes, thank you. That I was just recalling, Laura, that in psychotherapy that's called projection. So I just wanted to see if I understood that Roland was referring to a Betis in a kind of like an anti-Aufklärung or anti-critical. No, because I didn't understood quite right what you were trying to. I'm not sure that you were even talking about the same Betis.
No, I think, yeah, it's a very, of course, I say stupid things by saying that it's a complex concept, and okay, so I can't define it, and I won't define it, because that's precisely also a kind of that's a stupid attitude, I would say, in philosophy. Yeah, to ask, give me a definition of what Betis is, what you mean by Betis. So Betis is for me a totality of a problem, a problematic that you need to analyze in different levels, in different situations. You have stupidity in 17th century, what Pascal would call le ridicule. Yeah. What Descartes would call is esprit malsain, which is in fact a lack based on a lack of sensibility for the exigency of reality, yeah, and for the domain in which you are, symbolic domain, etc. That's a form of Betis. It can manifest itself on many levels: intellectual level, in speech, in emotions, that your emotion is completely inadequate, etc. So it's a lack of adequacy to the exigency of reality. So that's a form of Betis, but it's only one form. So there are many forms, and what I find interesting in Deleuze is the idea that you have two extremes. So you have, first of all, philosophy in Nietzschean sense that has as task to nuire à la bêtise, yeah, to be like, yeah, the wesp, yeah, the wesp in the la colmata of stupidity, yeah. But at the same moment he says, yeah, but the stupidity is also, yeah, it's the destiny, it's a fatality of every thought. Every thought finally tends to become stupid, yeah? So what I'm saying now in a certain context is radically stupid. And by repeating all the thing I've been saying now on stupidity, I mean, it's maybe for 10 years now that I'm working on that. It's dead. For me, it's dead. Yeah. So that matter is dead. Well, that's also a form of stupidity. In that sense, maybe you can compare it with pharmacon. So it's a dead letter. It's dead souls. It's completely, it's without any creativity anymore. That's a fatality of our thought. So that's a little bit, how to say that. And the next, I'm not defining stupidity. I'm just giving some hints for what interests me in that topic. So another idea that I used to describe this stupidity is what Sartre calls la mauvaise foi, bad faith. Yeah, it's someone that who instead of who tries to believe that all the things he says and that he manifests are the expression, the manifestation of something deeper, something real that really exists, yeah, like on the model of a stone. And that might be his principles, that might be his faith, that might be his past, etc. That he's just expression of something solid. Yeah? And that he wants to coincide with that kind of internal solidity. That's a form of bêtise. Once more, why? Because it proves that it creates an incapacity to adapt in an adequate way to the exigency of reality. For me, that's a model, a little bit of what authentic, if I may use that stupid word, relation to reality would be. Yeah? So the use of cliches, the use of pathetic reactions, also what happened yesterday, etc. What's the right answer to certain events, etc. That is what is at stake. Yeah? And that is for me nuire à la bêtise, not falling back into cliches, into everyday talk in all that thing. And for me, that's the task of a philosopher. Be à la hauteur des événements. That's a little bit.
So maybe we should have a follow-up session at some point on the bêtise and mimesis. We won't solve it today, and I promised to keep it concise, not over long. And this is I think that the discussion went very well. If there is disagreement, it means there is something to think. That is not bad. A lot of what you say, by the way, reminds me of Arendt's take on the banality of evil. And to the question of how to use the pharmacon, I think that there is no formula, and that the bêtise in the 90s, the way I see it now retrospectively, in the 80s, was the reproduction of Derridian readings on text that automatically applied the method to the text, and you already knew the result before starting reading. When Derrida did it, was brilliant. But when it was done by everybody, it was just boring and bad. And so being selective maybe in the approach and applying it to specific problems in which the concept is not too large, as Deleuze would say, but fits the body and fits the problem. It's something that each of us, I think, can try to do in a way or another. But unless there are other points that we want to make, maybe we can decide if there is any volunteer for the next session to introduce a brief text or a topic, and it needed be, Jacob, you did a fantastic work, and requires a lot of preparation, and I think we should be so generous with each other in these periods. We are spending so much time in front of screens, and it shouldn't take too much work to prepare and introduce the text. It can be short. There's no particular deadline. Just give us some food for thought and a starting point, and then everybody reads and jumps in, as we did today. So Jacob, you did an excellent job. Thanks so much for that.
When would be next session?
Well, we have to decide on a date, maybe on a month from now, if it works for you. You tell me, which date is free, if you can keep a Friday.
You think we still will be alive over a month?
I'm optimistic, huh?
Always.
Some of us will, at least that.
Not the best one, as always.
Some of us will be alive, but will wish they weren't.
Some of Teresa's questions about music reminded me, and Nidesh's thoughts about Stigler reminded me of one kind of sub-project that I need to take up and explore, which is there's this really interesting book by a musicologist called A Million Years of Music Making. And in that book, he's reading Leroy and Stigler and Derrida, and he's making the case that if you look at the earliest tools ever found, made a million years ago, there's still no explanation of exactly how they are made and so on. And he's making a case that in order to make those tools the way that they're made, you have to be able to do what he calls entrainment, which means to follow a rhythm with precision. Like that the operations that go into making the tools, the earliest tools, consist of a rhythmical operation, and it's a rhythmical operation that he ascribes entirely to mimesis, to imitation of others. Like you learn, because there's no language. A million years ago, there's no language. So you learn to make the tools by imitating, by following, not only by doing like the other one does, but by doing it rhythmically, by following in the rhythm of someone else's action. This is pre-hominid. He has this very very specific. So if no one has any other suggestions, this it ties with Stigler. With Stigler, it ties with Derrida on the question of what came first.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Yeah.
With techniques.
Very good idea.
Let's go for it.
Yeah.
Would the February the 27th work for most of you?
I've got a PhD defense on that day.
Well, that day, originally, there was a congress in Liège on la bêtise that has been cancelled for COVID reasons for the second time.
I've got a PhD defense, which is going online, so and I don't quite know what the timing is going to be.
Did you say February?
No. November.
No, but why did I hear February?
He said February, but he meant
November. Did they say February? Okay.
Yes, he said.
I'm already jumping ahead post-crisis, you know. Ortwin, when would you be free? And
well, December 4th would be good for me. That's just 1 week later.
Does December 1st work for people?
4th. Yeah, the Friday. I mean, we don't need to stick to Friday, but
yeah, no, Friday is good.
Yeah, it works for me.
Okay, let's do that. Perfect.
Daniel, December 4th.
Okay.
Then thanks so much to everybody for stimulating discussion. I'm glad we can continue online. It is a sort of pharmacon, and I think that the benefits are more than the poisonous side effects. At least we'll see how we survive the weekend. But
okay, have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.